It was an ordinary Tuesday morning at Clearwater Elementary. The kind of day where the sunlight filtered lazily through the windows, and the usual hum of students' chatter filled the air. Mrs. Thompson, a teacher with a reputation for being stern, was standing at the front of the classroom. With her glasses perched low on her nose, she surveyed the room, preparing for her favorite part of the day, the math challenge. "All right, class," Mrs. Thompson said, tapping her pointer stick against the chalkboard. "Today's lesson will be a bit different. We're going to do something that will separate the sheep from the goats." Her voice had a bit of bite to it, a challenge that she made no effort to soften. "I'm going to give you all a problem. Solve it, and I'll show you how you can advance to the next level. Fail, and you'll be stuck with me for the rest of the semester." The class grew quiet, their attention shifting to the equation Mrs. Thompson had just written on the board. It was a complex problem, one that even some of the brightest students in the class would struggle with. As she spoke, her eyes narrowed slightly, scanning the room as though searching for the one student who might show promise. "Now, let me warn you," she added with a grin that didn't quite reach her eyes, "this one is for the serious thinkers. Don't even bother trying if you're not up for it." A few students exchanged nervous glances. Some stared at the problem on the board, unsure where to even begin. One by one, their hands reached for their pencils, and the quiet scratch of graphite on paper filled the room. Most of them immediately started jotting down numbers and formulas, but no one dared to raise their hand just yet. At the back of the room sat a small figure, barely 5 feet tall. His name was Elon Musk. He had always been a quiet child, the kind of student who preferred to sit in the corner, minding his own business. His dark hair was messy, and his blue eyes were focused on the problem, seemingly unfazed by the challenge ahead of him. Mrs. Thompson, however, barely noticed him at first. She was far too busy watching the other students, waiting for the first person to raise their hand. She had no reason to suspect that Damien was anything more than an average 5-year-old. He was quiet, almost too quiet, and while his classmates whispered about him behind his back, no one, least of all Mrs. Thompson, realized just how much he understood. A few minutes passed. The others were still scribbling away, some looking up nervously to check if Mrs. Thompson was paying attention. But Damien was already done. His pencil had barely moved since the problem had been written on the board, yet he didn't look anxious at all. He simply sat there, staring at the equation in front of him as if it was a puzzle waiting to be solved. Without warning, Damien stood up and walked toward the front of the classroom. A few students noticed and whispered amongst themselves. Mrs. Thompson, still deep in conversation with a few other students about their progress, glanced over. Her eyes narrowed. "Damien," she said, her voice firm, "are you sure you're ready to tackle this problem? You're not even supposed to be up here yet." Damien met her gaze with quiet confidence. He nodded once, then turned to the board. The class went completely silent. Mrs. Thompson, already skeptical, watched intently as Damien picked up the chalk and began writing the solution. The steps he took were almost effortless. While the others had been struggling to even make sense of the equation, Damien solved it within seconds. He wasn't just following a standard formula, he was thinking outside the box, connecting concepts that most children his age wouldn't even understand. The answer appeared on the board, flawless and precise. Mrs. Thompson blinked. She glanced at the problem, then back at Damien, then at the other students. Her confidence in her teaching started to crack just a little. "Damien, how did you?" She stopped mid-sentence, momentarily speechless. "This isn't possible." The class erupted in quiet murmurs. Some of the kids gasped. How had a 5-year-old just solved such a complicated problem with ease? Damien, still standing at the front, turned around to face the room. He said nothing but smiled, the slightest hint of amusement in his eyes. Mrs. Thompson, still in shock, walked up to the board, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Her hand reached for the chalk as she double-checked the solution Damien had written. It was flawless. No one, she began, but then trailed off. How did you do that? The room was dead silent. Damien, who had always been a quiet observer, wasn't the type to brag. He simply walked back to his seat, his eyes never leaving Mrs. Thompson. He sat down and returned to his small notebook, as though nothing unusual had happened. But the classroom buzzed with confusion and curiosity. Mrs. Thompson was still trying to process what had just occurred. She cleared her throat and tried to regain control. "All right, class, settle down," she said, but there was a noticeable shakiness in her voice. "Damien, I expect you to explain how you came to that solution after class." The bell rang, signaling the end of the lesson. As the students gathered their things and prepared to leave, Damien slowly packed his backpack. He didn't seem concerned about Mrs. Thompson's reaction. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. Mrs. Thompson lingered by the door, waiting for Damien to approach her. The other students had already left, but she needed answers. "Damien," she began, her voice stern again, but this time with a hint of something else, embarrassment, maybe. "You can't just waltz in here and do something like that. This isn't a normal math problem for your age." Damien met her gaze, and in his calm, composed voice, he answered simply, "I just solved it." Mrs. Thompson frowned, her mind racing. This was far beyond anything she'd expected from a 5-year-old. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Mrs. Thompson thought to herself, trying to regain her composure. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? But as Damien Musk walked out of the classroom, he didn't feel the weight of the challenge. He had simply solved another puzzle. And this time, it had everyone around him questioning what they thought they knew. Little did they know, this was just the beginning of something far more extraordinary than they could ever imagine. Damien Musk was not like the other children at Clearwater Elementary. Where most kids were busy with their toys, video games, or running around the playground, Damien found comfort in solitude, surrounded by books and puzzles that only a few adults would dare attempt. At just 5 years old, his IQ had been quietly discovered by his parents, Elon Musk and Grimes. But they kept it a secret, mostly for his protection. Damien's parents had always known he was different, but neither of them had fully anticipated just how far his intelligence would stretch. Since he was a toddler, Damien had displayed an uncanny ability to understand things that most children his age couldn't even begin to grasp. By the time he was 3, he could name and explain the parts of a computer, and by 4, he had taught himself to read in multiple languages. His grasp of technology was as innate as breathing. However, his early years weren't without their struggles. Despite his impressive abilities, Damien had a hard time fitting in with other kids. While other children played make-believe games or raced their bikes around the neighborhood, Damien preferred quiet afternoons with books on space exploration, physics, and artificial intelligence. His parents, both deeply involved in their work, understood Damien's thirst for knowledge but also worried about the lack of social interaction. Elon Musk, despite being the tech mogul behind SpaceX and Tesla, had his own unique way of parenting. He valued independence and creativity above all else. He encouraged Damien to question everything, to explore the unknown, but he also believed in letting his son figure things out on his own. However, he often found himself wondering if the world would be ready for a child like Damien, someone with a mind so far ahead of his time. Grimes, on the other hand, was more in tune with Damien's emotional needs. She had a deep understanding of Damien's introverted nature and encouraged him to express himself creatively. While Elon focused on Damien's intellectual development, Grimes helped him navigate his feelings and relationships. They both knew their son was destined for something incredible, but they didn't want him to feel pressured or overwhelmed by expectations. At school, Damien was often an enigma. His classmates didn't understand why he didn't want to play their games or why he could recite complicated scientific theories during lunch. Some admired him from afar, while others, like Mrs. Thompson, saw him as an anomaly, someone who didn't quite belong. As the school year progressed, Damien's exceptional mind began to attract more attention. Teachers, like Mrs. Thompson, started to notice his ability to solve complex equations, but they dismissed it as a fluke. Damien was still a young child, after all. How could he possibly understand the kinds of problems they were presenting? What they didn't know was that Damien wasn't just some gifted child, he was a prodigy, a child whose brain worked on a completely different level. But Damien didn't care for the accolades or the praise. He wasn't interested in impressing anyone. He simply wanted to learn, to explore the mysteries of the universe. The classroom was his playground, and the equations on the board were puzzles waiting to be solved. He didn't see them as obstacles, he saw them as opportunities. His relationship with the other children at Clearwater was largely distant. While he occasionally played with a few kids, it was always on his terms. They didn't understand his brilliance, and in turn, Damien found it difficult to connect with them. That didn't mean he was lonely, far from it. He had his parents, who were both understanding and supportive, and he had his own world of ideas and inventions to keep him company. His father, Elon, often took Damien to SpaceX headquarters, where the young boy would wander through the high-tech labs, his eyes wide with wonder as he watched rockets and satellites being developed. Elon would point out the complex designs, explaining the engineering behind them in a way that Damien could comprehend. In these moments, Damien felt a sense of belonging. He was surrounded by a world that made sense to him, a world that felt like it had been built just for him to explore. At home, the Musk family's dynamic was unique. Elon was often caught up in his business ventures, while Grimes devoted much of her time to her music and creative projects. But when they were together, it was clear that they were a close-knit family. They didn't conform to the traditional norms, and that was something that Damien came to appreciate. He didn't have to pretend to be someone he wasn't. His parents understood that his mind was different, and they didn't try to force him into a mold that didn't fit. However, there was always the underlying question: how would Damien navigate a world that wasn't built for someone like him? How would he manage the expectations that would inevitably come with his genius? Damien often pondered these questions in the quiet moments of his day, especially when he was alone in his room. He didn't want to be treated differently, but he also couldn't deny that his mind worked in ways that others couldn't quite grasp. It was a constant balancing act, how to be true to himself while also fitting into a world that seemed designed for people who weren't quite as different as he was. Despite the pressures that came with his extraordinary intellect, Damien had a quiet confidence about him. He wasn't seeking attention, and he wasn't interested in being a prodigy for the sake of it. He simply wanted to understand the world, to unravel its mysteries, and to contribute in ways that would make a difference. His parents' decision to keep his IQ a secret was meant to protect him. They didn't want the world to treat him as some sort of circus act, to focus solely on his genius and not on the person he was becoming. But that secret was becoming harder to keep, especially as Damien's abilities continued to shine through at school. Teachers like Mrs. Thompson were beginning to take notice, and before long, Damien would be faced with the inevitable question: what do you do when the world finally discovers your secret? For now, though, Damien continued his quiet life at Clearwater Elementary, navigating his way through a world that didn't quite understand him. But that was about to change. The equation Mrs. Thompson had given him wasn't just a random problem, it was the beginning of something much bigger. And as he walked through the halls of Clearwater, Damien had no idea just how much his life was about to shift. The world was waking up to the genius that lay within him, and it was only a matter of time before everything would change. The following morning, the atmosphere at Clearwater Elementary was anything but ordinary. The other students were still buzzing about the day before, whispering amongst themselves about Elon Musk and his mysterious ability to solve that impossible equation. While most of them were intrigued, a few of the older kids were envious. The idea that a 5-year-old could outsmart them in a subject they had been studying for years didn't sit well with their pride. And none of them, especially Mrs. Thompson, had quite figured out what to make of it. Mrs. Thompson had spent the entire evening replaying the events in her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about Damien and the impossible solution he had written on the board. She was a seasoned educator, someone who had taught for over a decade. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for a moment like this. It was almost as if she had encountered a living puzzle, a puzzle that she couldn't quite crack. That morning, she approached Damien as he walked into the classroom. His usual calm demeanor hadn't changed, but there was an air of quiet confidence about him that caught her off guard. She watched him carefully as he took his seat, not even glancing at the other students, who were still murmuring about his genius. "Damien," Mrs. Thompson said, walking towards him, her voice firm but tinged with curiosity. "I need you to come with me for a moment." Damien didn't flinch. He simply stood up, his small figure almost lost in the sea of desks. The other students' eyes followed him as he walked past them, unsure of what was going on. They went to the back of the classroom, where Mrs. Thompson pulled out a notebook, a pencil, and an extra piece of paper. She placed the sheet in front of Damien and said, "I need you to solve something for me. I want to see if you're really as capable as you made it seem yesterday." Damien didn't answer. He sat down at the desk, still unfazed, his gaze fixed on the paper. Mrs. Thompson watched him intently, trying to gauge his next move. "Let's see if you can solve this one," Mrs. Thompson said as she wrote another equation on the board, a problem that was even more difficult than the previous one. Without saying a word, Damien picked up the pencil and started working on the problem. The other students watched from their seats, their eyes wide with curiosity. Some were eager to see if Damien would succeed again, while others hoped he would stumble. But Damien was already deep in thought, his pencil moving quickly as he sketched out the solution. Mrs. Thompson tried to hide her unease as she watched the process unfold. Damien was like no student she had ever encountered. As he finished the problem in record time, she couldn't help but feel both impressed and frustrated. It was one thing to solve a problem, but to do it with such ease, without hesitation, was beyond her comprehension. The other students remained silent, watching the boy who was quickly becoming the center of attention. When Damien finished, he put his pencil down and looked up at Mrs. Thompson. "It's done," he said calmly. Mrs. Thompson's eyes flickered between the equation on the board and Damien's paper. The solution was flawless, once again. There was no mistake, no flaw, no hesitation in his work. She could feel the weight of her disbelief creeping up on her. She had expected Damien to falter, to miss something, anything, that would explain how he had been able to solve the equations so easily. But there was nothing. "Damien," she finally said, her voice more serious than before, "how do you know how to do this?" He blinked, his expression unreadable. "I just understand it." Mrs. Thompson's brow furrowed. "But, you're only 5 years old. You shouldn't even be able to understand this level of math." Damien didn't respond, but his eyes seemed to say everything she needed to know. He didn't care about age or rules, he cared about understanding the problem and finding the answer. To him, that was all that mattered. Mrs. Thompson was both intrigued and slightly unnerved by the situation. She had been a teacher long enough to know when something extraordinary was happening, but this was beyond anything she had experienced. Damien wasn't just a bright child, he was something else entirely. Something she couldn't quite explain. The other students, now sensing the tension in the air, began whispering among themselves. Some of them had already come to the conclusion that Damien was different, but now it was becoming undeniable. No one had ever seen anyone like him, especially not at such a young age. Mrs. Thompson had to know more. She wasn't just going to let this go without getting to the bottom of it. Her desire to understand was no longer just about teaching, it was about proving something. Proving that her experience as a teacher was more than enough to handle a child prodigy. "Damien," she said, her voice growing more insistent, "I need to understand how you do this. This isn't normal. How do you solve these problems?" Damien looked up at her, his blue eyes steady and calm. "I just think about it. That's how you solve any problem, right?" Mrs. Thompson clenched her jaw, trying to contain her frustration. Damien's nonchalant attitude was both maddening and fascinating. She had expected him to explain in more detail, to break down the process. But he wasn't going to do that. Not because he didn't want to, but because, to him, there was nothing extraordinary about it. Mrs. Thompson let out a deep sigh, running her fingers through her hair. "All right, Damien. I'll give you this one. But we need to talk to your parents." Damien didn't react, but his eyes narrowed just slightly, as if he had anticipated the request. Mrs. Thompson didn't realize it yet, but Damien's parents were already well aware of his abilities. They had been protecting him from the world's expectations for years. They had wanted to let him grow at his own pace, to allow him to discover his talents without the pressure of being in the public eye. However, Damien wasn't like other kids. His mind didn't work in the same way, and soon, it would be clear to everyone that keeping him in the shadows wouldn't be possible much longer. As Mrs. Thompson left the room, her thoughts were racing. This wasn't just a challenge anymore. This was something much bigger, something that she wasn't prepared for. She had no idea that this was the beginning of something that would not only change Damien's life but would forever alter the course of his education, and perhaps even the world. The following week, Mrs. Thompson's curiosity about Damien Musk only deepened. She had been wrestling with her thoughts, unable to shake off the nagging feeling that something extraordinary was happening right under her nose. Damien wasn't just a child prodigy, he was something entirely different. But what? And why did he seem so, unbothered by it all? Her determination grew, and she decided to take a step she knew would change everything. It was time to talk to Elon Musk and Grimes, to get to the bottom of Damien's abilities and learn whether they knew just how exceptional their son truly was. She had no idea that this simple conversation would lead to a series of events that would send her, and Damien, on a journey neither of them could have predicted. That Thursday afternoon, Mrs. Thompson finally got the chance to meet with Elon and Grimes. It wasn't a formal meeting, just a casual chat about Damien's progress at school, or so it seemed. But as she walked into the room at the Musk family's home, she immediately sensed that this conversation would be anything but casual. Grimes greeted her with a smile that seemed warm but reserved. She looked every bit the artist she was, her platinum blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, her attire casual yet chic, with the distinct air of someone who didn't quite fit into societal norms but didn't care to. Elon, on the other hand, was more focused. His typical demeanor was hard to read, serious, direct, but also thoughtful, as if he was always calculating the next move in whatever conversation he was having. "Thank you for meeting with us, Mrs. Thompson," Elon said, shaking her hand. "Is something wrong with Damien? He's been performing fine, hasn't he?" "Oh, yes, he's doing exceptionally well. It's just that, there's something unusual about his abilities," Mrs. Thompson began, her words carefully chosen. "And I'm concerned." Grimes raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. Elon sat down, motioning for Mrs. Thompson to take a seat as well. "You see, Damien's been solving equations that are well above his grade level, problems that no 5-year-old should even be able to comprehend," Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice steady but laced with disbelief. "Yesterday, he solved one of the most difficult problems I've ever given him in a matter of minutes. And the accuracy was flawless. No mistakes. And that's not all. There's something about the way he approaches everything, it's like he doesn't even see problems as problems. He just understands them. I'm worried about what this might mean for his future." Elon and Grimes exchanged a look. For a brief moment, it was as if time stood still. Neither of them seemed shocked by Mrs. Thompson's words. It was as if they had been waiting for someone to notice. Finally, it was Elon who spoke. "Damien's mind works in ways most people can't understand. He's gifted, more so than you might think," Elon said, his tone calm but serious. "We've known about his abilities for a while. In fact, we've been doing our best to protect him from being overwhelmed by the world's expectations. Mrs. Thompson leaned forward. But why? Why keep it a secret? Grimes smiled, but it was a bittersweet smile. It's not about hiding him. It's about letting him grow at his own pace. We didn't want to put him in a position where his genius became the focus of everything he did. We wanted him to have a childhood. Elon nodded in agreement. The world doesn't always know how to handle kids like Damien. They'll either try to turn him into a spectacle or force him into a box that doesn't fit. We didn't want that for him. We just wanted him to be a kid, to be able to explore, to think. Mrs. Thompson was silent for a moment. She had suspected something like this, but hearing it from Damien's parents brought it all into sharp focus. So, you knew all along, and you've been protecting him from the pressures of being a prodigy? Yes, Grimes answered simply. Damien isn't just a child who can solve math problems. He's a child who sees the world differently. His mind is always working, always analyzing. He's incredibly intuitive, but he also has the capacity to create and innovate like no one I've ever met. Elon looked at Mrs. Thompson. We didn't want the world to label him or push him into a role he didn't choose. We wanted him to discover his own path, at his own pace. The weight of their words hit Mrs. Thompson harder than she expected. She had heard of child prodigies before, of course, there were many in the history of science and arts. But Damien was different. His mind didn't just learn, it understood in ways that surpassed human comprehension. What were the consequences of growing up with such an immense gift? She suddenly realized that the journey she was embarking on wasn't just about Damien's future, it was about the entire world's future. If Damien's genius went unnoticed or misunderstood, it could be a tragedy. But if he were to be placed on a pedestal too soon, could it also be a burden? So, what happens now? Mrs. Thompson asked, her voice tinged with both concern and curiosity. He's only 5. How will he deal with all of this as he grows older? Elon's eyes softened. We don't know. That's the challenge. But we're doing our best to give him a foundation where he can flourish. He's not just another student. He's someone who will change the world, in his own way. And we need to give him the space to do that. Grimes added, we don't want to force him into anything. But we also don't want him to lose sight of what's important, his sense of wonder, his ability to ask questions and explore. As Mrs. Thompson listened to them, she felt a deep sense of respect for the Musk family's commitment to Damien's well-being. They weren't just trying to protect him from the world, they were trying to ensure that his gift didn't overwhelm him. But even so, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but wonder if the world would be able to handle Damien when the time came. And the time was coming sooner than anyone expected. The following days felt like a whirlwind for Mrs. Thompson. What started as a simple concern about Damien's abilities had quickly spiraled into something much bigger. The school board had already been informed about Damien's remarkable talent, and soon, whispers spread among the teachers and staff. The pressure was mounting, and no one knew how to manage it. As much as Mrs. Thompson wanted to shield Damien from the growing attention, it seemed impossible to keep him in the shadows any longer. By the end of the week, the local news caught wind of the story. A reporter had somehow learned about the boy genius at Clearwater Elementary, and before Mrs. Thompson knew it, cameras and microphones were hovering around the school gates. What had been a quiet, relatively normal elementary school was suddenly thrust into the public eye. And with it came the harsh reality that Damien's life would never be the same. That afternoon, as Damien walked into school, he could already sense something was different. The usual chatter among the students had changed. There were more eyes on him. More whispers. More stares. The children who had once been curious and puzzled by his abilities were now openly talking about him. They were trying to figure out how a 5-year-old could understand things that took adults years to master. The idea of a child genius was both fascinating and intimidating to them. Damien, however, appeared unfazed. He continued his routine as usual, silent, calm, and seemingly unaffected. But deep down, he felt something he had never felt before: pressure. For the first time, Damien was aware of the weight of others' expectations. Mrs. Thompson noticed it immediately. When Damien entered the classroom that morning, he seemed more distant than usual. His eyes were dull, and he had the air of someone who had seen too much too soon. She wondered if the attention had finally started to take its toll on him. She decided to check in with him privately. "Damien," Mrs. Thompson said softly, catching his attention after class, "I need to talk to you for a moment." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes. The same eyes that had once sparkled with curiosity now seemed heavy, burdened. "You all right?" she asked gently. Damien nodded, though Mrs. Thompson wasn't entirely convinced. He looked down at his hands, a small frown pulling at his lips. "It's hard." "What's hard?" Mrs. Thompson asked, her voice filled with concern. "Everything. Everyone keeps asking me to do things, to show them what I can do. I don't know how to make them stop," he said quietly. Mrs. Thompson's heart broke for him. She had always known that Damien was unique, but she hadn't realized the toll it could take on him. A 5-year-old shouldn't have to carry the burden of everyone's expectations. "You don't have to do anything for anyone else, Damien," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice firm but soothing. "You just need to be yourself. You don't have to prove anything to anyone." Damien looked up at her, his eyes wide with an emotion she couldn't quite place. He seemed like he wanted to say something but hesitated. "It's just, so much. I can't make it stop. I don't want to be special. I just want to be like everyone else," he said, his voice small. Mrs. Thompson knelt beside him, her heart aching for the little boy who had so much pressure placed on him at such a young age. "Damien, you don't have to be like anyone else. You're special, yes. But that doesn't mean you have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. You get to decide what your life looks like. You don't have to let anyone else tell you who you should be." Damien nodded slowly, but it was clear the words hadn't fully sunk in yet. He was still a little boy, and the world was expecting him to act like an adult. Mrs. Thompson could only imagine how confusing and overwhelming that must feel for him. As the day went on, the media frenzy outside the school only grew. The news stations began airing clips of Damien's supposed genius, making him a local celebrity. People from all walks of life wanted to meet the boy wonder. Calls flooded into the school, and the pressure continued to mount. By the time Damien arrived home, the media had already caught up with him. News vans lined the streets, and reporters hovered around his family's gate, hoping for a glimpse of the child who had captured the world's attention. Inside the house, Elon and Grimes sat together in the living room, looking at the TV coverage in disbelief. They had known this day was coming, but they hadn't expected it to be so overwhelming. "Damien isn't ready for this," Grimes said softly, her voice filled with worry. "He's only 5. He can't carry the world on his shoulders." Elon nodded, his face serious. "We've tried to protect him, but we can't keep him hidden forever. The world is going to know about him sooner or later." They were right. The pressure was already taking a toll. That night, Damien didn't sleep. His mind raced with thoughts of equations, problems, and people watching him. He had never asked for this, he didn't even understand why people wanted to know what he could do. He just wanted to be left alone, to play with his toys, to do normal kid things. But that wasn't possible anymore. In the middle of the night, he wandered to his parents' room. His small frame stood in the doorway, and when Elon and Grimes saw him, they could tell something was wrong. "Hey, buddy," Elon said softly, pulling Damien into the bed beside him. "What's on your mind?" Damien curled up against him, his small voice trembling. "Why do people want so much from me?" Elon's heart sank. He had known this day would come, but hearing it from his son made it all too real. "They don't understand you, Damien. They don't know what it's like to be you," Elon said, his voice full of emotion. But we'll make sure you don't have to carry this alone. You're not in this by yourself. We'll protect you. But Damien didn't feel protected. He felt exposed. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of the world pressing down on him, and he didn't know how to escape it. The days following that tense night were filled with a quiet sort of heaviness. Elon and Grimes had decided to step back from the media frenzy, allowing Damien some breathing room. The headlines about the boy genius continued to dominate local news, but inside their home, the Musk family did their best to maintain a sense of normalcy. Yet, the world wasn't going to let Damien's brilliance go unnoticed forever. Every day, more and more people sought to speak with him, whether they were reporters, scientists, or curious strangers hoping to catch a glimpse of the extraordinary child. It seemed like there was no escaping it. But amidst the chaos, something inside Damien began to shift. The pressure, while still overwhelming, didn't feel quite as suffocating as it had before. The words Mrs. Thompson had spoken to him, about not needing to prove anything to anyone, echoed in his mind. For the first time in days, Damien felt as though he could take a breath, even if just for a moment. It wasn't easy, though. In school, the other kids still treated him like a curiosity, and while some admired his abilities, others felt resentment. Damien didn't understand why his intelligence had made him a target, but he began to notice something important: it wasn't his fault. He wasn't responsible for how others perceived him. One afternoon, as Damien sat in the school courtyard, lost in thought, Mrs. Thompson approached him again. This time, though, he didn't seem as distant as before. He looked up at her with a quiet determination. "Hi, Damien," she said gently. "How are you feeling today?" Damien thought for a moment before answering. "Better. I still don't like all the people watching me, but I think I understand now, it's not about them. It's about what I want to do." Mrs. Thompson smiled, a sense of relief washing over her. "I'm proud of you, Damien. It takes a lot of strength to figure that out, especially at your age." He gave her a small, thoughtful nod. "I don't want to be anyone's science experiment or circus trick," he said, his voice steady. "But I think I want to help people. I don't know how yet, but I will." That was the turning point. The realization hit both Mrs. Thompson and Damien at once. For all the pressures of being a child prodigy, for all the spotlight and public scrutiny, Damien was still just a child. He didn't want to be labeled. He didn't want to be pushed into a corner by others' expectations. What he wanted, above all else, was to explore and discover at his own pace. And if he could use his gifts to make the world a better place, he would. But on his own terms. Mrs. Thompson took a step back, watching him carefully. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now," she said softly. "But remember, you don't have to do it alone. You've got a whole team of people here to support you." Elon and Grimes, who had been listening from a distance, nodded in agreement. Elon spoke up first. "Damien, you don't owe anyone anything. You are who you are. You don't have to change for anyone." Grimes added, "And if you want to help people, we'll make sure you have the tools you need. But you get to decide how and when you share your gifts with the world." For the first time in weeks, Damien allowed himself to smile. It wasn't the carefree smile of a child unaware of the world's complexities, but a genuine, knowing smile. It was a smile that reflected both the weight of the situation and the resolve to handle it. That evening, after the last of the reporters had left their property and the house had settled into a quiet stillness, Damien found himself reflecting on the past few days. He had spent so much time trying to avoid the spotlight, but now, for the first time, he saw that it didn't have to be a burden. It was simply a part of his life, a part that he would learn to navigate, not to avoid. Elon sat beside him on the porch, gazing out over the night sky. "What's on your mind, Damien?" "I think I understand now," Damien said, his voice calm. "I can't control how the world sees me, but I can control how I use what I know." Elon looked down at his son, his heart swelling with pride. That's right. And I know you'll find your way. Just remember, it's okay to make mistakes along the way. You don't have to have all the answers right now. Grimes, sitting on the other side of Damien, placed her hand on his shoulder. We'll be here, no matter what you decide. The weight of those words sank in. Damien didn't have to change for anyone else. He didn't have to carry the weight of the world's expectations on his shoulders. He could take his time, discover his path, and, most importantly, be true to himself. As the night went on, the world outside remained oblivious to the quiet shift taking place inside the Musk household. The public's fascination with Damien would eventually fade, replaced by new stories, new faces, new fads. But for Damien, this experience had been a lesson in resilience. He had learned that being different wasn't something to be ashamed of, it was something to embrace. And as the stars twinkled above, Damien Musk, just a 5-year-old boy, looked up at the vast expanse of the universe, knowing that his journey had just begun. The world was out there, waiting for him, and he was ready to face it, not as a spectacle, but as someone who would change it. The following weeks were a turning point for Damien. With the media frenzy slowly dissipating, he was no longer under constant surveillance. The school returned to a semblance of normalcy, with the teachers focusing more on their usual curriculum and less on Damien's extraordinary abilities. Yet, despite the quietude, the inner pressure he had felt from the outside world remained, though it had shifted in focus. Now, he wasn't trying to escape being special. Instead, he was left alone with the question that haunted him more than any formula or equation: what do I do with all this? Damien had already made his decision to stop trying to live up to anyone else's expectations, but that didn't answer the bigger question of what to do with the gift of intelligence that set him apart from everyone else. His thoughts wandered in and out of focus as he pondered the various ways he could use his mind to make an impact on the world. At first, Damien sought refuge in his favorite hobby, building things. His toys, blocks, and intricate gadgets were scattered across his bedroom floor in a chaotic, but somehow organized, display of mechanical creativity. He would spend hours with tiny screws, nuts, and bolts, putting things together just to take them apart again. There was something soothing about constructing and deconstructing objects. It gave him a sense of control, something he didn't always feel when it came to dealing with people. One afternoon, Elon walked into the room, his eyes catching the various half-finished projects scattered about. He smiled to himself, a bit amazed by the fact that his son could be so immersed in these small, intricate creations. "You've been busy," Elon remarked, kneeling down beside Damien. Damien looked up, his expression serious. "I'm trying to figure out how things work. I know how to make stuff, but I don't know how to make people understand." Elon's smile softened. He could see the underlying worry in Damien's words. It wasn't just about building things. It was about being seen for more than just his intelligence. "You're already helping people, Damien," Elon said, a thought forming in his mind. "You just don't realize it yet. Sometimes, helping others doesn't have to be big or flashy. It's the small things that matter most." Damien furrowed his brow, unsure of what his father meant. "But I don't want to just build things. I want to do something. Something that will make a difference." Elon placed a hand gently on Damien's shoulder. "You've got the rest of your life to figure out how you want to make a difference. But remember, sometimes, just by being yourself and doing what you love, you'll inspire others to do the same. That's how change starts." Grimes, who had been listening quietly from the doorway, approached and added, "And don't forget, you don't have to do everything by yourself. You've got us, and you've got people who care about you." For the first time in weeks, Damien felt a small but growing sense of clarity. He didn't need to have it all figured out right now. He could take his time, explore his passions, and see where they led. Perhaps, in time, he would discover the best way to use his genius to benefit others. Later that week, after school, Mrs. Thompson approached him again, noticing that he seemed more at ease. "You seem different lately," she said, as they sat down for a one-on-one conversation. More focused, maybe. Damien nodded, looking down at the desk as he spun a pencil between his fingers. I'm trying to figure out what I can do that matters. I don't want to just be known for being smart. I want to do something good with it. Mrs. Thompson smiled warmly. I think you're on the right track, Damien. The fact that you're even thinking about how to help others shows a lot about who you are. Don't rush. It'll come to you. As the days passed, Damien continued to explore his creativity. He dabbled in coding, created simple machines with his toys, and even started drawing designs for new inventions. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that his true interest wasn't in the inventions themselves, it was in how these inventions could change the world. One evening, as Damien sat at the dinner table with his family, his mind began to race with possibilities. He had always loved space, science, and technology. The curiosity he had as a child about the stars had never faded. If anything, it had grown stronger. What if he could create something that could help people in ways no one had ever imagined? What if his genius could be used to solve bigger problems, like climate change or world hunger? I've been thinking, Damien began, breaking the silence at the dinner table. I want to learn how to help people in bigger ways. Not just by building things. I want to do something that matters. Elon and Grimes exchanged a knowing glance. What do you mean? Grimes asked, her voice gentle but filled with curiosity. I want to learn about energy, like the kind that can help the planet, Damien said with a spark of excitement in his voice. I want to build something that can help the Earth. Something that can give people clean energy, without hurting the planet. Elon's eyes widened with surprise, but he couldn't hide the admiration in his gaze. That's a big idea, Damien. But it's a good one. We'll help you find the right resources and people to guide you, but you need to promise me one thing, you're not doing this because of the pressure. You're doing it because it's something you care about. Damien's face lit up with a smile. I promise. I want to make the world better. I don't want to just be a smart kid. I want to help people. I want to do something good. That night, Elon and Grimes had a long conversation about Damien's newfound purpose. They knew this was the beginning of something important, but they also knew that Damien would face many challenges along the way. The world would try to push him into roles he didn't want, but they vowed to support him no matter what path he chose. It was at that moment, as they sat around the dinner table, that Damien realized that his journey wasn't about being seen as different. It was about using his difference to do something meaningful. He had spent so much time trying to escape the pressures of being labeled a genius, but now, he understood. Being different was his strength. Damien's decision to pursue clean energy was more than just a passing thought, it was a spark, a passion that ignited inside him. For the first time in his life, he felt like he wasn't just part of a world he didn't understand. He was going to create change. But even though his dream was clear, the road ahead wasn't going to be simple or without its hurdles. Elon had always been a supporter of his son's curiosity, but this time, he understood just how vast the undertaking was. Clean energy was an enormous field, filled with complex science, cutting-edge technologies, and solutions that had been developed over decades. To be part of it, Damien would need to go beyond his toys, his small inventions, and even his brilliant mind. He would need to understand the world and the people in it, not just the machines. It was a Saturday afternoon when Elon sat down with Damien in the family's study, a cozy room lined with bookshelves filled with tomes on science, engineering, and innovation. The dim light from the window cast soft shadows over the pages of a clean energy book laid open on the desk. So, Damien, Elon began, his voice thoughtful, I think we need to break this down. Clean energy is a huge field, and I'm glad you're passionate about it. But let's take it one step at a time. We'll start small, learn the basics, and then we'll build on it. Damien nodded, his small hands gripping the edge of the desk as he listened intently. I know it's going to take time, he said, a flicker of determination in his young eyes. "But I want to make a real difference." Elon smiled and opened the book in front of them, pointing to a diagram illustrating solar panels. "This is a good place to start. Solar energy is one of the most accessible and sustainable energy sources we have right now. Let's start by learning about how solar panels work and how they can help reduce our reliance on fossil fuels." Over the next few weeks, Damien threw himself into his studies with a newfound zeal. He read books on renewable energy, attended online lectures with Elon, and even worked on simple projects like building small solar-powered gadgets. It wasn't easy, especially when he came across ideas he didn't understand at first. But each time he struggled, he pushed himself harder. There were times when he felt frustrated, when the terms seemed too technical or the equations didn't make sense. But he kept at it, determined to find the key that would unlock his understanding. Meanwhile, outside of the classroom, the world began to take notice of Damien's budding passion. The press, which had slowly faded from his life, started to hover again, picking up on the fact that Elon Musk wasn't just any child prodigy. He was a young boy with an ambition that few could match. Soon, a request came in for an interview with a major news network. It wasn't just a passing interest in his life, it was a spotlight on his potential to change the world. At first, Elon was hesitant. He didn't want Damien to feel like he was constantly under pressure. But after a discussion with Grimes, they agreed that if Damien wanted to speak out about his passion for clean energy, this could be a great platform for him to start making a difference. The interview was set for a Sunday afternoon. Damien was nervous, more nervous than he had ever been. He had spoken in front of his family and friends before, but speaking to a wide audience was an entirely different matter. Elon and Grimes reassured him, telling him that he could take his time and answer the questions however he felt most comfortable. The day of the interview, Damien stood in front of a camera, feeling both small and large at the same time. The room was quiet, the only sounds being the faint buzz of the studio lights overhead. The host of the interview, a respected news anchor named Karen Lawson, smiled warmly at him. "So, Damien, I hear you've been working on some pretty exciting things in the world of clean energy. Can you tell us a little bit about why you've chosen this path?" Karen asked, her voice kind but inquisitive. Damien took a deep breath. He had been practicing his answers for days, but now, in front of the cameras, he wasn't sure what words would come out. Still, he focused on the message he wanted to share. "I think the world is in trouble," he said, his voice surprisingly clear for such a young child. "There's too much pollution and too many people using energy that hurts the planet. I want to help change that. I want to build things that can help the Earth, like solar panels or even wind turbines, so people can use energy that doesn't hurt the environment." Karen nodded, impressed by Damien's maturity and thoughtfulness. "That's a big dream, Damien. Do you have a plan on how you'll make that happen?" Damien hesitated for a moment, then replied, "Not yet. But I'm learning. I'm reading a lot and working with my dad to understand how things work. I know it's going to take time, but I'm not giving up." The interview continued for another hour, and by the end, Karen was visibly moved by Damien's sincerity and conviction. "You're a very inspiring young man, Damien," she said, as the cameras cut to a close. "I think we'll all be hearing a lot more about you in the years to come." When the interview aired later that evening, the world took notice. Social media exploded with praise for Elon Musk, the 5-year-old child prodigy who wasn't just a genius, he was a visionary. But there were mixed reactions too. While many praised his intelligence and ambition, others questioned whether a child his age could truly grasp the enormity of the task he had set for himself. Some felt that Damien was being pushed too hard, that he should be enjoying his childhood instead of tackling global issues. For the first time in his life, Damien found himself facing criticism. The pressure was back, and it was heavier than ever. That night, as Damien lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was being watched, not just by people who wanted to support him, but by those who expected too much, too soon. He thought back to his conversation with Elon and Grimes earlier that day, the one where they had reminded him that he didn't need to have all the answers right away. Still, Damien felt the weight of the world bearing down on him. The expectations of the media, his parents, even himself, was he ready for this? But deep down, Damien knew he couldn't let the criticism stop him. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be fast, but he was ready to keep learning and growing. He would find his way, just as he had promised himself. Damien's first real challenge in his journey toward creating a clean energy solution was a daunting one. He had, for weeks, been researching solar energy and the technology behind it. With his father's support, he had gained access to some of the most cutting-edge research and design tools that Elon used in his own ventures. Still, as excited as Damien was to embark on his project, the reality of it set in. Turning an idea into something tangible wasn't easy. It started with his first project, a solar-powered device that could store energy more efficiently. He had a grand vision of how it could be used in homes and schools to reduce electricity costs and promote environmental sustainability. The theory sounded great, but turning the theory into practice proved to be a different beast entirely. One weekend, after weeks of planning, Damien set up his workspace in the garage. It was a large space, usually reserved for Elon's more experimental projects, but today, it was all his. The table in front of him was covered with blueprints, components, and a few half-assembled devices. The intricate diagrams were his creation, inspired by his understanding of solar energy and storage systems. He had researched extensively and carefully selected the materials he believed would work best. However, when he began putting the pieces together, things didn't go as smoothly as he had hoped. First, there was the wiring. The battery system he had designed wasn't generating the energy he had anticipated. Every time he tried to test it, the system either short-circuited or the panels didn't produce enough energy to power the storage unit. It was a constant cycle of frustration, and each failed attempt made Damien feel as if he was missing a key piece of the puzzle. The more he worked, the more the doubts crept in. Could he really pull this off? Was he biting off more than he could chew? Despite his brilliance, he was still just a 5-year-old boy trying to tackle a problem that many seasoned scientists and engineers were still grappling with. After days of struggling, Damien sat on the floor, his head resting in his hands. The project lay in front of him like a shattered dream, a collection of parts that just wouldn't come together. Elon walked into the garage and paused when he saw his son in this moment of defeat. He could feel the weight of Damien's frustration, but he didn't rush to offer solutions. Instead, he knelt down beside him. "You're stuck, huh?" Elon asked gently. Damien nodded, not looking up. "I can't make it work. No matter what I do, it's wrong. I'm not smart enough to do this." Elon smiled softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're smart enough, Damien. But being smart doesn't mean you always get things right on the first try. In fact, you'll probably fail more times than you succeed. But those failures are just as important as the successes. They teach you what doesn't work, so you can find a way that does." Damien glanced up at his father, a mixture of confusion and frustration still on his face. "But what if I never figure it out? What if I'm not as smart as people think I am?" Elon's voice was calm, filled with the wisdom he had gained over the years. Being smart isn't about never failing. It's about learning from your mistakes and growing stronger because of them. I've had more failures than you can count, Damien, but every one of them led me closer to success. And I know you'll get there too. You just have to keep going. Damien sat silently for a moment, processing his father's words. It wasn't the kind of reassurance he had expected. He had wanted a quick fix, a way out of the frustration. But what his father was offering was something much more profound, the idea that failure was part of the process. It wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. Later that day, after taking a break and having some time to reflect, Damien returned to his workbench. He began to go over the designs again, this time with a new perspective. Instead of focusing on the failures, he started looking for patterns in what had gone wrong. He re-examined the wiring, adjusted the power inputs, and tried new materials that could potentially increase efficiency. As he worked, Damien found himself remembering something his mother, Grimes, had told him during one of their talks. It's okay to be different. You don't have to be like anyone else. You have your own way of thinking, and that's something to be proud of. The words resonated with him now. He had always felt like he didn't fit in with the other kids at school. But in this moment, alone in the garage with his project, he realized that his ability to think differently was exactly what would help him succeed. The usual ways of doing things didn't always apply to him, and perhaps that was where his greatest strength lay. By the end of the weekend, he had reworked his design. While the device was still a long way from being perfect, it worked, at least enough to show that he was on the right path. The energy output wasn't impressive yet, but it was a start. Damien felt a surge of pride in his small victory, and for the first time, he realized that every step forward, no matter how small, mattered. When Elon came into the garage the next morning, he was pleasantly surprised. Damien was sitting at the workbench, his eyes bright with excitement. "I think I fixed it," Damien said, his voice filled with cautious optimism. Elon stepped closer, inspecting the setup. The device was still a bit rough around the edges, but the system was running, albeit at a low capacity. It was a breakthrough, and for Damien, it felt monumental. "You did," Elon said with pride. "This is exactly how it's supposed to work. Not every problem gets solved in one try. But the important thing is that you didn't give up." Damien beamed, a sense of accomplishment filling him. The doubts and frustrations were still there, but now he knew how to tackle them. With each setback, he was learning, improving, and growing. Later that evening, as he sat down to eat dinner with his family, Damien's thoughts drifted to the bigger picture. He wasn't just solving a problem for himself, he was building something that could one day make a difference in the world. There were still many obstacles ahead, but he had learned an important lesson: the road to success was filled with hurdles. And every time he overcame one, he was one step closer to his goal. With his small but significant success in creating a working solar-powered device, Elon Musk felt a sense of achievement. But that satisfaction was quickly overshadowed by the realization that the road to creating a real, impactful clean energy solution was filled with unexpected challenges. The project was not as simple as fixing a device or adjusting a few wires. It was much more complex, much bigger than he had initially anticipated. As he prepared for the next phase of his solar-powered storage device, Damien found himself diving into a web of new problems. He had managed to make the device work at a small scale, but it was nowhere near functional enough to be practical or efficient on a larger scale. The first big challenge was the energy output. The device could only hold a fraction of the energy needed to power a home or even a single appliance. It was a start, but it was far from enough. This was when Damien realized the weight of his decision. He had seen solar panels on houses and been fascinated by their ability to harness the sun's energy. But what he didn't understand was how difficult it was to make that energy storage process efficient enough to be used on a larger scale. Damien spent days researching different methods for improving the device. He learned about lithium-ion batteries, energy grids, and solar efficiency, but the more he learned, the more complicated the field seemed. There were so many different factors to consider, and no single solution could work for every situation. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with thousands of pieces, each one more complicated than the last. But even as the obstacles seemed insurmountable, Damien refused to let them defeat him. His resolve only grew stronger. He kept pushing himself to learn more, even when things seemed beyond his reach. But there was one thing that began to weigh on him more than anything else: the constant pressure. The media's interest in him had only intensified since his first public interview. People were watching him, waiting for him to fail or succeed. The expectations felt like a constant pressure on his shoulders. One evening, after another frustrating day of research, Damien walked into the living room to find his father sitting by the fireplace, reading. Elon looked up and saw the exhaustion in his son's eyes. Damien had been quiet for hours, and something about the silence felt different from his usual focus. Elon set his book down and motioned for Damien to sit beside him. "What's on your mind, Damien?" he asked, his voice calm but knowing. Damien hesitated before sitting down next to his father. "I don't think I can do this, Dad. It's too much. There are so many things I don't understand, and no matter how much I try, I can't make it work." Elon studied his son for a moment. He could see the frustration and doubt written all over Damien's face. Elon had always believed in his son's potential, but he also knew that the path Damien had chosen wasn't easy. It was a journey that would require not just intelligence, but resilience. "It's okay to feel that way," Elon said, his voice steady. "You've taken on a huge challenge, and it's natural to feel overwhelmed. But you don't have to do it alone. You have a team, and you have the resources to learn from the best." Damien shook his head. "But what if I don't get it? What if I'm just not smart enough?" Elon smiled softly, the flicker of the fire casting shadows over his face. "Being smart isn't about never feeling stuck, Damien. It's about how you handle those moments. When things are tough, that's when you grow the most. Think about all the times I've failed. I've lost count of the number of projects I've had to scrap. But each failure has taught me something new. And each time, I've learned something that eventually helped me get closer to my goals." Damien didn't respond right away. He thought about his father's words, and although he knew they were meant to comfort him, they didn't immediately ease his anxiety. The reality was that Damien wasn't sure he could keep up this level of effort, especially when the future seemed so uncertain. Every new discovery only seemed to open up more questions than answers. But his father wasn't done yet. "You know, Damien, when I started SpaceX, everyone told me I was crazy," Elon continued. "They said rockets were impossible. They said a private company could never build a spacecraft. But I didn't listen to them. I pushed forward, because I knew there was something there. I believed in my ability to solve problems. And that's what you have to do, too. You have to trust in your ability to find solutions, even when it doesn't seem possible." Damien looked up at his father. "Do you ever feel scared, Dad? Like you might fail?" Elon nodded slowly, a rare vulnerability in his eyes. "All the time. But I learned that fear isn't something to run from. It's something to use. Fear means you're on the edge of something important. If you're afraid of failing, that means you care about what you're doing. And that's the first step in figuring it out." Damien sat quietly, reflecting on what his father had said. For the first time in days, the weight on his shoulders seemed just a little lighter. Maybe it was okay to feel uncertain. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to have everything figured out right now. The most important thing was to keep trying, to keep learning, and to stay focused on the bigger goal. The next morning, Damien woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The night's conversation with his father had given him clarity. He knew he wasn't alone in this journey. He had a support system, and most importantly, he had a mind that was capable of solving problems. He just had to keep going, even when it was hard. He went straight to the garage, where his project lay waiting for him. As he began to tinker with the device again, he felt a small but steady sense of confidence. He wasn't sure if today would be the day everything clicked. But he knew he was one step closer to understanding the problem, one step closer to the solution. As he worked, he realized something important. It wasn't just about solving a technical issue. It was about growing, learning, and becoming someone who didn't give up in the face of adversity. And that was the true path to success. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Damien's work in the garage had become a daily ritual. As the days passed, he refined his solar-powered storage device bit by bit, learning more about the complexities of energy efficiency and design. Every success was incremental, a step closer to what he envisioned, a game-changing device that could revolutionize energy storage. And yet, despite his progress, doubt still lingered in the back of his mind. Was this project ever going to be as powerful as he imagined? Was it too ambitious for someone his age? But Damien wasn't the type to back down from a challenge. Even when the road seemed too long, he reminded himself of the small victories that had gotten him this far. He had already learned so much about engineering, energy systems, and problem-solving, much more than most adults would even think to tackle. Each problem he faced only drove him to dive deeper, to find new answers, to improve. And with the full support of his family behind him, he knew there was no turning back now. One evening, after another long day spent trying to improve the output efficiency of the solar panels, Damien found himself sitting in front of his workbench, exhaustion weighing on him. He had reached another frustrating dead end. The energy output from his device was still far from satisfactory, and he couldn't seem to get the wiring to work properly with the new adjustments he had made. At that moment, Damien's frustration bubbled over. He leaned back in his chair, running his fingers through his hair in exasperation. He had put countless hours into this project. What if it was all for nothing? Just as he was about to give in to those negative thoughts, he remembered something his father had told him: don't be afraid to ask for help when you're stuck. You're never alone in your journey. That simple reminder struck a chord. It was easy for Damien to get lost in his own head, focused on the pressure to succeed on his own, but he hadn't considered reaching out for guidance in a while. He had the best minds in the world at his disposal. His father, Elon Musk, had not only built some of the most impressive technology in the world, but he also knew the value of collaboration and teamwork. Damien had been so consumed with the idea of solving everything on his own that he had forgotten to tap into the resources that were right in front of him. With renewed energy, Damien grabbed his phone and called his father, who was in his office late into the evening working on SpaceX projects. "Dad?" Damien's voice trembled with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. "I think I need some help. There's something wrong with the storage system, and I'm not sure what to do next. Could you come take a look?" Elon's response was immediate. "Of course, Damien. I'll be there in a minute." Within moments, Elon entered the garage, his face lighting up when he saw his son's determination, despite the obvious exhaustion in his eyes. The room was filled with parts, blueprints, and a small workbench that had clearly seen better days. But amidst the chaos, there was also a sense of purpose. "What's going on?" Elon asked, kneeling next to Damien, who had already started to explain the problem. Damien took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. "I've been trying to improve the battery storage. I've made the panels work okay, but the storage part keeps underperforming. I tried switching out the components, but it's not giving me the output I need. I don't know where I'm going wrong." Elon studied the design for a few moments. He didn't rush in to offer a solution, just like Damien had learned to do. Instead, he asked questions, probing, testing, making observations. They spent the next few hours working together, going over the intricacies of the design. Elon's experience was invaluable, not just in terms of his technical knowledge but also his approach to problem solving. He wasn't looking for perfection in the first attempt, he was looking for ways to improve, step by step. It was during one of these small adjustments that Elon noticed something Damien had missed: an issue with the conductivity of the wiring between the solar panels and the storage unit. It was a simple oversight, but it was one that had been preventing the system from functioning properly. By making a small change to the wiring setup and optimizing the connection points, they were able to significantly increase the efficiency of the energy transfer. "Damien, look at this," Elon said, pointing to the newly adjusted system. "You've done the hardest part already by putting in the groundwork. Now, we just need to tweak the small things that make the difference. Your attention to detail is excellent, but sometimes the simplest things are the key." Damien looked at the device, a rush of excitement flooding through him as the numbers on his energy output gauge began to climb higher. It wasn't perfect yet, but the needle was moving in the right direction. For the first time, the system seemed to be working the way it was supposed to. He couldn't hide his grin. It's working. It's actually working. Elon chuckled, his voice warm with pride. See? I told you. You just needed to let the process play out. It wasn't about genius moments or a sudden breakthrough. It was about hard work, patience, and persistence. For the first time since he started the project, Damien felt a real sense of accomplishment. He knew there was still work to be done, still many more challenges to face, but this breakthrough felt like a turning point. He wasn't just tinkering with pieces anymore, he was solving problems, innovating, and learning how to take failure in stride. The next day, with his confidence boosted, Damien continued refining the device. He experimented with different configurations, and each change brought small improvements. Over the course of the following weeks, the solar-powered storage unit began to take shape into something much more impressive. Damien could see the potential now, and his hope for the future of his invention grew with each passing day. As the project moved forward, Damien began receiving more attention from the media and experts in the field. It was clear that his invention had potential, and the press began calling him a young genius, comparing him to some of the world's top engineers and innovators. But despite the praise and attention, Damien kept his focus on what mattered most, solving the problem he had set out to fix. But the pressure was beginning to mount. The more attention his work garnered, the more Damien felt the weight of expectations. Would he be able to deliver on the promise he had made to himself? Could he live up to the hype? Only time would tell. But for now, Damien was ready for whatever came next, armed with a newfound sense of confidence, a breakthrough under his belt, and the unwavering belief that he was on the right path. As the weeks passed, Damien's solar-powered storage device continued to show promise. His progress, while steady, had been achieved through sheer determination and a willingness to learn from his failures. But now, the challenges he faced were becoming larger and more complex. The device was no longer just an experiment in his garage, it was beginning to look like a legitimate product. It was at this point that Damien realized something crucial: he needed help. When he first embarked on this project, it had been a personal challenge. He wanted to prove to himself that he could tackle a monumental task. Now, though, his vision had grown. He wasn't just building a device for himself anymore. He wanted to change the world. And to do that, he couldn't carry the weight alone. Damien's father, Elon, had always been an advocate for team collaboration, and the more Damien thought about it, the more he understood why. To make this project work on a larger scale, he needed expertise beyond his own. He needed a team, a group of people who shared his vision and were just as determined as he was to push boundaries. One afternoon, while Damien was reviewing the plans for the next phase of the project, his father walked into the garage with a familiar look in his eyes. "You've been at this for weeks now, Damien. You've made incredible progress. But I think it's time you take the next step, building your own team." Damien looked up from his work, his brow furrowing in confusion. "A team? But I've been doing this myself. I've figured out a lot already." Elon smiled. "That's true. But you can't do everything alone. Even I had to learn how to work with a team. You'll need people who can focus on different parts of the project, engineers, designers, even business professionals who can help with production and scaling. You're ready for this next phase, Damien. You have a vision, but now you need to learn how to lead." Damien's heart raced at the thought. Leadership? He had never thought of himself as a leader before. But the more he considered it, the more he realized that this was the natural progression of the project. If he truly wanted to bring his invention to life, he couldn't do it on his own. He had to learn how to lead a team, how to delegate, how to motivate others to believe in his dream. The idea was daunting, but he knew that it was the right move. With his father's guidance, Damien began the process of assembling a team. His first step was to reach out to experts in the field of renewable energy, particularly those who specialized in energy storage systems. After countless emails, phone calls, and video conferences, he managed to assemble a small group of engineers who were eager to collaborate on his project. It wasn't long before they began meeting in the garage, brainstorming ideas, and diving deep into the technical aspects of the device. Damien felt a mix of awe and excitement as he watched the experts work. Each person brought a unique perspective, and their collective knowledge added depth and clarity to his initial ideas. But despite the new energy in the room, Damien found himself struggling with his new role. As much as he had wanted a team, he had no idea how to manage the dynamics. It was one thing to be the youngest person in the room, but now, as the leader, he felt a pressure he hadn't anticipated. How could he make decisions when he was still learning? How could he lead people who were far older and more experienced than he was? One evening, after a long day of meetings, Damien sat down with his father to talk about the challenges he was facing. "Dad, I'm not sure I can do this. I don't know how to lead. These people are older and more experienced than I am. I don't even know what I'm supposed to say or how to get them to follow me." Elon looked at his son, understanding the weight of his words. "Leadership is not about having all the answers, Damien. It's about guiding the team, listening to their ideas, and creating a shared vision. Your role is to inspire them, not to know everything. You're not in charge because you're the smartest person in the room, you're in charge because you have a vision, and you've shown that you can make that vision a reality." Damien nodded slowly, processing his father's words. It was true, he didn't have to have all the answers. He just needed to be the one who believed in the project the most, the one who could keep everyone focused on the end goal. He needed to lead with confidence, not perfection. With renewed determination, Damien approached his team the next day with a sense of purpose. He called them together and shared his vision in a way that he hadn't before. He spoke passionately about the potential of his solar-powered storage device, how it could change the way the world approached energy consumption, and how their contributions could make a lasting impact. To his surprise, the team responded with enthusiasm. They had already seen Damien's brilliance firsthand, and now, they were inspired by his drive and conviction. They saw in him a leader, not because of his age or experience, but because of his unwavering commitment to the project and his ability to inspire those around him. As the days turned into weeks, Damien's leadership began to take shape. He learned to listen to his team, to ask for their input, and to make decisions that incorporated their expertise. But he also learned when to trust his instincts, when to stand firm in his vision, and when to push the team to move forward despite challenges. It was a delicate balance, but Damien was beginning to master it. The project began to take off in ways Damien had never imagined. With his team in place, the solar-powered storage device became more sophisticated and efficient. They started building prototypes that were not only functional but scalable. The idea of a small garage project was quickly evolving into something that could be produced on a larger scale. But with the success came new challenges. The expectations from the public and the media were growing, and Damien knew that the next step would require him to manage not only the technical aspects of the project but also the business side. He would need to secure funding, negotiate partnerships, and develop a marketing strategy. And all of that would require a new set of skills. But for now, Damien was focused on one thing, leading his team to create a product that could change the world. The weight of leadership still felt heavy at times, but he was no longer afraid of it. He had learned that leadership was not about having all the answers, it was about inspiring others, making decisions with conviction, and staying true to your vision. And as the solar-powered storage device began to take shape, Damien knew that this was just the beginning. The journey was far from over, and the challenges would only grow bigger. But he was ready. As Damien and his team made strides with their solar-powered storage device, the excitement within the garage was palpable. With each passing day, the prototype grew more sophisticated, and the project was steadily becoming more viable. But with success came the reality of one massive challenge that no amount of innovation or determination could solve alone: money. The idea had always been there in the back of Damien's mind, but it was starting to weigh more heavily on him as he watched the team's hard work take shape. To bring the project to life, they needed resources, big ones. They needed money to build larger prototypes, refine the technology, and eventually start production on a scale that could make a real impact. There was no way around it. They needed funding. Damien had spent weeks researching how companies like Tesla and SpaceX had raised capital in their early days, learning about venture capital, angel investors, and crowdfunding. But the reality was that he didn't have much of a plan. How could a 5-year-old convince someone to invest in a project that seemed too risky, too uncertain? The odds felt insurmountable. One afternoon, as Damien and his team were working through final adjustments on the prototype, Elon walked into the garage with an idea. "Damien," he began, "I think it's time we talk about next steps. Your team is doing amazing work, but to take this to the next level, we need to figure out how to fund it. Have you thought about who could be the right investors for this project?" Damien paused, his hands stilling on the wires he was working with. He had been so focused on the technical aspects of the project that the business side had slipped to the back of his mind. But now, hearing his father's words, he knew it was time to confront the issue head-on. "I've thought about it, but I don't know how we'll convince investors." "I mean, I'm just a kid," Damien said, his voice filled with uncertainty. Elon gave a knowing smile. "Being young doesn't disqualify you, Damien. In fact, in many ways, it gives you an advantage. People love innovation, especially when it's coming from someone who isn't afraid to push boundaries. What you need to focus on is the vision, what makes your project unique and why it has the potential to change the world. If you can show them that, investors will take you seriously." Damien absorbed his father's words carefully. He had always known that his project was more than just a school project, it was something bigger, something that could truly transform the energy industry. But now he had to communicate that vision to people who might not understand the potential as deeply as he did. "I don't know if I'm ready to talk to investors, though," Damien confessed. "I still don't know exactly what I should say or how to convince them." Elon placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his voice calm and reassuring. "You've already started something incredible here. You've shown that you have the ability to think outside the box, to solve problems in ways that others can't. The hardest part is often just taking that first step. You won't have all the answers, and you don't need to. But you do need to believe in your project and show others why it's worth believing in." With his father's encouragement, Damien knew what he had to do next. The first step was to gather information. Who were the right investors? Where could they find people who shared his passion for renewable energy? He and his team spent the next few days researching venture capitalists who had a history of investing in cutting-edge technology and sustainability projects. Damien's mind raced with possibilities as he pored over lists of investors and their past investments. Finally, they came across a firm that had funded several clean energy startups, and their portfolio included companies that worked with both solar and energy storage systems. It seemed like the perfect fit. Damien wrote his first pitch email, explaining the vision for the project and how their innovation could have a massive impact on the world's energy consumption. He highlighted the potential for scalability and the device's ability to reduce energy costs, all while being environmentally friendly. The next morning, Damien anxiously hit send. He had taken the first step towards securing funding, but now, the waiting began. Days passed with no response. The pressure of the silence felt heavy. The longer it went on, the more Damien wondered if they had made a mistake. Had he been too optimistic? Were they simply too small a project for serious investors to care about? But then, just as Damien was starting to lose hope, an email arrived in his inbox. His heart skipped a beat as he opened it. It was from the venture capital firm. "We're intrigued by your project, Damien," the email began. We believe that innovation in the renewable energy sector is crucial to the future of the planet, and we're interested in learning more about your solar storage device. Let's schedule a meeting to discuss how we can move forward together. Damien felt a rush of excitement. It was happening. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, and Damien knew it was time to prepare. He spent every moment he could refining the details of the project, making sure he could answer any questions that might arise. He worked closely with his team, practicing the pitch over and over again until it was perfect. His father, Elon, gave him advice on how to present the project confidently, emphasizing the importance of communicating the vision clearly and succinctly. The day of the meeting arrived, and Damien was both nervous and excited as he sat in front of the computer screen with his father by his side. The investors were on the other end of the call, and it was time to make his case. "Good afternoon, Damien," the lead investor began, a middle-aged man with a friendly but serious demeanor. "We've reviewed your project, and we're excited to hear more about it. Tell us why you think your solar-powered storage device is the next big thing." Damien took a deep breath, steadying himself before he spoke. This was the moment he had been preparing for. He wasn't just a kid in a garage anymore, he was a visionary, and this was his chance to prove it. He began speaking passionately, outlining the potential impact of the device. He spoke about the environmental benefits, the scalability, and how it could help solve the world's growing energy crisis. He didn't focus on the technical details too much. He kept it clear and simple, making sure the investors understood the core idea. As the meeting progressed, Damien felt a sense of calm wash over him. His nerves faded, replaced with the knowledge that he had already done the hardest part. He had believed in his project enough to get this far. Now, it was just about sharing that belief with others. When the meeting ended, the investors expressed their interest in moving forward. "We see the potential here, Damien," they said. "We're excited to help bring your project to the next level." Damien couldn't believe it. They had secured the funding they needed to take the project further. The future was suddenly looking much brighter. With the funding secured, Damien and his team now found themselves on the brink of transforming their solar-powered storage device from a prototype into a product. It was a huge milestone, but also one that came with immense pressure. They no longer had the luxury of being a small startup working quietly in a garage. They were now on the radar of investors, the media, and anyone with an interest in renewable energy. Expectations were sky-high, and the clock was ticking. The first hurdle they faced was scaling the device. Up until now, Damien and his team had worked with small prototypes, using basic materials and making everything by hand. But to bring the device to market, they needed to increase production, refine the design, and ensure the technology was efficient enough to meet real-world demands. That meant upgrading their manufacturing process, finding suppliers, and testing the device at a much larger scale. Damien sat in a meeting with his team, reviewing the steps ahead. His mind was racing, the weight of the task ahead pressing on his chest. "We need to improve the efficiency of our battery storage system," Damien said, his voice steady despite the mounting pressure. "Our current model is good for prototypes, but to be commercially viable, we need to double the capacity without compromising on the energy output." One of the engineers, Maria, spoke up. "We've already made a lot of improvements in terms of material selection, but the scalability is the biggest concern. We're working with limited resources. We'll need to find new suppliers, maybe even partner with other companies to get the parts we need." Damien nodded. It was a tough reality to face, but he knew Maria was right. They had to secure the right materials and suppliers, ones that could meet the demands of mass production while still keeping costs manageable. His team immediately set to work on contacting potential partners, researching new suppliers, and refining the manufacturing process. But even as they moved forward, Damien couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in his stomach. They were no longer just playing around with ideas, they were on the verge of something real, and with that came the pressure to succeed. The pressure grew even more when the media started taking an interest in their project. It started with a small feature on a tech blog, but within a few days, the story had picked up steam. Soon, they were being invited to speak at conferences, to give interviews, and to present their product to a wider audience. The attention was both exciting and overwhelming. Damien found himself standing in front of a crowd at a renewable energy conference just a few weeks after the funding had been secured. The bright lights and sea of unfamiliar faces made his stomach churn, but he knew this was an important moment. This was his chance to present the vision he had worked so hard for. Elon, Damien whispered to his father, who was standing beside him, offering silent support, "I don't know if I'm ready for this. What if I mess up? What if they don't take me seriously?" Elon gave his son a reassuring smile. "You've already shown them what you can do, Damien. You're more than ready. Just speak from the heart. They'll see your passion." As Damien took the stage, his nerves were still there, but they were no longer paralyzing. He had a mission, a purpose, and a team that believed in him. He could do this. The audience fell silent as he began speaking, explaining his project and the impact it could have on the world's energy future. He shared the vision of creating a cleaner, more sustainable world, and how the solar-powered storage device could play a major role in that shift. As he spoke, the tension in his shoulders eased. His words flowed more naturally, and soon, he wasn't just talking to the crowd, he was inspiring them. By the time Damien finished, the applause was thunderous. The overwhelming feeling of validation hit him. The media buzz around their project grew even louder, with more and more people praising his vision and his ability to lead a team. The attention was flattering, but it also amplified the pressure. That night, as Damien and his father sat together in the hotel room, Elon turned to him. "You did great today. I'm proud of you, Damien." "Thanks, Dad. But the real work starts now. I feel like everything's moving so fast, and I'm not sure if we can keep up." Elon nodded. "That's the challenge of innovation. The more successful you are, the more pressure you face. But remember, this is what you wanted. You wanted to change the world, and now the world is starting to take notice. You can't afford to back down now." The next few days were filled with meetings, interviews, and planning sessions. Damien felt as if he were constantly being pulled in 100 different directions. He had to make decisions about scaling production, negotiating partnerships, and handling the media. But amidst the chaos, he found himself more determined than ever. This was his project, his dream, and he would not let the pressure break him. But as the weeks passed, Damien realized that the challenges weren't just about technical problems and business negotiations. The true test was in managing the expectations that were now on his shoulders. Investors were pushing for results, the media was expecting rapid progress, and his team was starting to feel the strain as well. Everyone was working tirelessly, but the weight of the project was beginning to show in small ways. Maria pulled Damien aside one afternoon, her brow furrowed with concern. "We're hitting a roadblock with the battery efficiency. The improvements we've made so far just aren't enough to meet the scale we need. If we push any further, the costs will spiral out of control." Damien felt a knot form in his stomach. This was exactly the kind of problem they needed to avoid. If they couldn't fix this issue, it could spell disaster for the entire project. "Let's take a step back," Damien said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We've come this far, and we'll find a solution. We have to. Let's brainstorm new approaches. We can't give up now." It was moments like these when the pressure truly hit. The weight of the project, the stakes, and the expectations felt heavier than ever. But Damien also realized something: he couldn't face these challenges alone. He had a team, and together, they could figure out a way to push through. The pressure on Damien and his team was palpable, but amidst the mounting obstacles, there was an unwavering resolve in the air. They had come this far, and they knew that quitting wasn't an option. As the days stretched on, the team worked tirelessly to overcome the technological hurdles that had begun to feel insurmountable. They were stuck. But that wasn't the end of the story. Damien spent countless nights locked in the lab with Maria and the engineers, trying to make sense of the problems they were facing. The battery efficiency was the core issue, and if they couldn't improve it, their entire project could fail before it even took off. They needed a breakthrough, and they needed it fast. One evening, as the team worked late into the night, Maria slammed her hand down on the table in frustration. "We've tried every material we can think of. We've tweaked the system 1,000 times, and nothing's improving." Damien sat back in his chair, feeling exhausted. The weight of responsibility was starting to take its toll, but he couldn't afford to give up now. "We're missing something," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "Something small that's holding us back." The room fell silent. Maria, who had always been the most pragmatic of the team, looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" Damien stood up, pacing in front of the whiteboard where they had sketched out the design, outlining all the potential improvements they had explored. "We've been so focused on improving the materials and components, but maybe we're not looking at the system as a whole. Maybe we need to reimagine the way we're managing energy storage, not just the parts we're using." Maria raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on." Damien stopped pacing and pointed at the diagram on the board. "What if we modify the way the device stores and releases energy? Instead of focusing on just making the battery more powerful, what if we create a hybrid system that uses both traditional battery technology and newer energy capture techniques? A multi-layered approach might give us the flexibility we need to optimize both efficiency and cost." Maria's eyes widened. "That's a bold idea. But it could work. We could integrate small-scale energy capture systems, like piezoelectric materials, which convert mechanical stress into electrical energy. That would give the device the ability to recharge itself even while in use, reducing strain on the battery." Damien smiled, feeling the spark of excitement that had eluded him for weeks. "Exactly. Let's give it a shot. We don't have anything to lose at this point, but we need to work quickly. The investors are expecting results soon, and we can't afford to waste any more time." The team dove headfirst into the new approach, researching piezoelectric materials and other supplementary energy sources that could work within the framework of the solar storage device. It was an all-hands-on-deck effort. Damien, Maria, and the engineers worked day and night, running simulations and testing prototypes. The pressure to deliver weighed on all of them, but they were driven by a shared belief that they could succeed, if they worked together. After several weeks of intense work, the new hybrid system was ready for testing. The team had integrated piezoelectric materials and other energy capture elements into the existing battery system, creating a prototype that was more efficient and capable of self-charging in small increments. They were ready for the first round of real-world tests. Damien felt a knot in his stomach as he watched the device charge up for the first time. Would it work? Would this breakthrough be enough to get them over the line? He held his breath as the numbers on the monitor climbed, showing the energy output increasing steadily. For the first time in weeks, the team watched as the system began to stabilize and perform better than expected. "We did it," Maria said, her voice filled with awe. Damien could barely contain his excitement. "It's working. It's actually working." The breakthrough was everything they had hoped for, and more. The hybrid system not only improved efficiency but also offered the potential to scale quickly and affordably. The energy capture feature reduced the strain on the battery, making the device more durable and cost-effective. They had found the answer they had been searching for. With the new prototype in hand, Damien and his team knew that they were finally ready to take the next step. But this wasn't just about technical success. They had overcome the odds, the pressure, and the doubts. The real test was how they would handle the world's expectations now that they had something tangible to show for their work. The next day, Damien stood before his team in the lab, his heart racing. They had done it. They had cracked the code. But as he looked around at the team that had stuck by him through it all, he knew that this was only the beginning. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in weeks, the future didn't seem so uncertain. "We have a working prototype," Damien said, his voice steady. "But this is just the start. We've proven that we can make this work, but now we have to prove to the world that it's worth investing in. We have the potential to change everything, but only if we keep pushing forward." His team nodded in agreement, the exhaustion and frustration of the past few months replaced by renewed determination. They were ready for the next phase. As Damien and his team began preparing for their next big presentation to the investors, Damien felt a sense of calm. He knew they had the solution now, but the real challenge would be presenting it in a way that showed not only the potential of the device but also their ability to execute on the vision. The weeks leading up to the big meeting were filled with intense preparations. Damien worked closely with his father, Elon, who offered advice on how to present their breakthrough to investors in a way that highlighted both the technology and the long-term potential. It wasn't just about having a working prototype, it was about showing that the project was scalable, sustainable, and ready for mass production. The day of the meeting arrived, and Damien stood at the front of the room, facing the investors who had supported them from the start. The moment was tense, but Damien was no longer the nervous child he had been months ago. He was a leader, a visionary, and this was his chance to show the world what he and his team had accomplished. With a deep breath, Damien began his presentation, showcasing the hybrid solar storage device. As he spoke about the breakthrough and the potential impact on the world's energy systems, he saw the investors' faces light up. They were listening. They were impressed. By the end of the presentation, one of the investors stood up, clapping. "Damien," he said, his voice filled with admiration, "what you've shown us today is nothing short of revolutionary. We believe in your vision, and we're excited to continue supporting you as you take this to the next level." It was a moment of validation, of everything Damien had worked for finally coming to fruition. But as he looked at his team, he knew that this success wasn't just his own, it was theirs as well. Together, they had achieved the impossible. The excitement from the investor meeting hadn't worn off yet, but reality was beginning to settle in. With the funding secured and the prototype proven, Damien knew they had a long and difficult road ahead of them. The real test would be turning their breakthrough into a product that could be produced at scale, and that would require navigating complex manufacturing processes, logistics, and, above all, meeting the high expectations that were now upon them. Damien stood in front of a large conference table in the company's new office space, which they had just moved into with the influx of funding. He looked around at the faces of his team, each one eager and determined but also aware of the massive task ahead. The energy in the room was palpable, but so was the weight of the challenge. "We've got the investors backing us. We have a working prototype. But now it's time to take the leap from research and development to full-scale production," Damien said, his voice steady but full of conviction. "It's not going to be easy, but I know we can do it. This is where we prove that we're more than just a startup. We're a force for change." The team nodded in agreement, but there was an unspoken understanding that the road ahead would not be smooth. The pressure had only just begun. The first step was finding the right manufacturers to produce the hybrid solar storage device at scale. The materials they used were specialized, and while they had already established relationships with a few suppliers, scaling up production meant forging new partnerships, ones that could meet their needs and standards. There was no room for mistakes. One misstep could mean delays, rising costs, or worse, compromising the quality of the product. Damien and his team worked closely with Maria, the lead engineer, to refine their design for mass production. They had to optimize the device for both efficiency and cost, while ensuring that it could be produced quickly and consistently. "Have you narrowed down the manufacturers we'll be working with?" Damien asked Maria, who was reviewing a long list of potential partners. "I've spoken to a few companies that specialize in renewable energy products," Maria replied, her focus unwavering. "But we're going to need a partner who can not only handle the complexity of our design but also scale production in a way that meets the timeline we need. It's a tall order." Damien ran a hand through his hair, frustration mounting. I know. It feels like we're constantly in over our heads, but we don't have time to waste. We need to get this right the first time. Maria nodded, but she didn't back down. We will. We just need to keep pushing forward. Meanwhile, as they focused on production, the world outside their bubble was starting to take notice in ways they hadn't anticipated. Media outlets were clamoring for interviews, and the demand for updates on their progress was growing by the day. The public wanted to know more about the revolutionary technology that could change the way the world used and stored energy. And with every new interview, every new article, the expectations became heavier. Damien found himself giving more and more interviews, trying to balance public relations with the demands of production. His phone was constantly ringing, emails flooding his inbox. It was exhausting, but it came with the territory of a growing business. As much as he enjoyed the recognition and the potential to make a real difference, he couldn't shake the feeling that the more success they had, the harder it became to keep up with everything. One evening, as Damien was wrapping up another interview, his father, Elon, called him. "Damien, how's everything going with the production side?" Elon asked, his voice calm but filled with interest. "It's going well, but we're at a crossroads. We're fine-tuning the design, but the manufacturing process is a beast. We need to find the right partner, and fast." Elon was quiet for a moment, as though considering Damien's words. "I know it feels like a race against time, but remember that this is a marathon, not a sprint. Don't rush the process just because the pressure's building. If you're not careful, it could backfire. You want to get it right, even if it takes a little longer." Damien sighed, appreciating his father's advice but feeling the weight of the clock ticking. "I know, Dad. But we have to move quickly. The investors are counting on us, and I can feel the pressure mounting every day. Just make sure you're not sacrificing quality for speed. Don't lose sight of why you started this in the first place." Damien nodded, though his mind was already racing through the possible next steps. "Thanks, Dad. I'll keep that in mind." Despite his father's wise words, the tension continued to rise. After weeks of vetting manufacturers, they finally narrowed it down to one company that seemed promising. They had the right expertise, the capacity for mass production, and a history of working with renewable energy products. But even as they signed the contract and moved forward, Damien couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were overlooking something. The team was ready to start producing the first batch of units, but the pressure to meet deadlines and hit the numbers promised to the investors was overwhelming. Every day, it felt like a new challenge arose: production delays, supply chain issues, and even a few quality control problems with the first test batch. Damien spent countless hours on calls with the manufacturer, trying to iron out the kinks and keep things on track. He couldn't afford to let this slip through his fingers, not after everything they had gone through to get this far. One evening, Damien sat alone in his office, staring at the stack of reports on his desk. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, and for the first time, he wondered if he was truly ready for the full responsibility of running a global company. Was he doing enough? Was he making the right choices? Could he handle the intense pressure and keep his vision intact? He stood up and walked over to the window, gazing out at the city below. The lights twinkled in the distance, a constant reminder of the world they were about to change. He couldn't afford to doubt himself, not now. Damien took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and returned to his desk. There was no turning back. He would face whatever came next head-on. The momentum had been building, but so had the pressure. The product launch was just around the corner, and with it came the looming weight of expectation. Damien could feel it in every conversation, every meeting, and every late-night call. There was no room for error. Their solar-powered hybrid storage device had the potential to change the world, but the road to that kind of success was never without its obstacles. It wasn't just the media and investors who were watching, the entire industry was waiting. Would they be able to deliver on their promises? Was this breakthrough technology as revolutionary as it seemed, Or was it just another overhyped product destined to fall short? Damien sat in his office, his mind spinning. The first batch of units was supposed to be ready for shipment within days, but there had been a series of setbacks. The manufacturing plant had reported delays in sourcing one of the key components, and when they tested the units, the efficiency didn't match the prototype's performance. It wasn't a major issue, but it was enough to cause concern. If the product didn't meet expectations in terms of efficiency, they could lose everything. His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. It was Maria. "Damien, we need to talk. There's something going on at the factory." Damien's heart sank. "What's happening?" "It's the battery integration. The new hybrid system we designed isn't working as expected on a large scale. The performance is erratic. We need to make adjustments, but it might delay the launch." Damien ran a hand over his face. "How long are we talking about? A few days? A week?" Maria hesitated. "It could be longer. We may need to redesign some of the internal systems." "It's a tough call." Damien felt the walls closing in around him. The stakes had never been higher. The investors had given them an ultimatum: deliver the product on time, or risk losing their support. The media was already buzzing about the imminent release, and any delay would give their competitors an opening. It was a high-stakes game, and there was no room for failure. "Is there any way to fix this quickly?" Damien asked, his voice strained. "I'm not sure," Maria replied. "But I'll gather the team and see if we can find a solution. I'll keep you posted." Damien hung up the phone and took a deep breath. He needed to think, to focus, but it felt like everything was spinning out of control. He couldn't afford to lose the momentum they had built. Not now. He called a meeting with the leadership team to discuss the situation. When they gathered in the conference room, the tension was palpable. Everyone knew how much was riding on this moment. "We're facing a critical issue with the production," Damien said, laying it out for the team. "The hybrid system isn't performing consistently, and we might have to delay the launch if we can't get it right. We're looking at a major setback, and the investors won't be happy about it." The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. Maria spoke up, her voice calm but resolute. "We can fix this, but it's going to take time. We need to adjust the way we're integrating the hybrid system into the battery. If we can optimize the energy flow, we might be able to stabilize the performance." Damien nodded, his mind racing. "How long will it take?" "It's hard to say. We may need to redesign some of the internal components, but we can try a few quick fixes to improve the performance in the meantime," Maria said, her eyes focused on the problem at hand. Damien leaned back in his chair, running through the options in his mind. They were at a crossroads. If they delayed the launch, they risked losing credibility with the investors, the media, and the public. But if they moved forward without fixing the issues, they could face even bigger problems down the road. "I don't have a lot of time," Damien said. "The investors are breathing down our necks. But I don't want to rush this and compromise the quality of the product. We need a solution, and we need it fast." There was a long pause. Then, Elon's voice broke the silence. "Damien, I think you're at a tipping point here. You've worked hard to get this far, and now you have a choice. You can either push forward and risk the product failing, or you can take a step back and make sure it's right. You've always believed in the long-term vision. Now is the time to be patient, even if it means a delay." Damien looked at his father, the weight of his words sinking in. He knew Elon was right. They had spent years developing this technology, and a few more weeks to ensure it was perfect could make all the difference. But the pressure to meet deadlines was overwhelming. He had built something with the potential to change the world, but at what cost? "Thanks, Dad," Damien said, his voice heavy. "I'll take that into consideration." The meeting continued as the team discussed the technical details of how they could work around the production issues. Maria and the engineers developed a plan to tweak the integration process, while Damien and the marketing team started preparing contingency plans in case the launch was delayed. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best they could do under the circumstances. As the days passed, Damien found himself at the factory almost every day, checking in on the progress. Every time he spoke with Maria, the news was a little better, but the stress was starting to take its toll on him. It seemed like there was always another issue to solve, another hurdle to overcome. And every time he thought they were close to a solution, a new challenge would appear. One evening, after a particularly long day of troubleshooting, Damien stood alone in the factory, staring at the test units. They were almost there. He could feel it. But the weight of the decisions he had to make was suffocating. It was easy to get lost in the day-to-day problems, but the bigger picture was always on his mind. If they got this right, it could change everything, but if they didn't, the dream might be over before it even started. Damien closed his eyes for a moment, trying to clear his mind. He had always believed in the power of innovation, in pushing the limits of what was possible. But now, the stakes were real. The world was waiting. And so was he. The tension in the air was thick. Damien had thought that once they had made the decision to delay the product launch, the pressure would ease. But instead, it felt like it doubled. The media was relentless in asking for updates, and the investors were anxious about the timeline. While Damien knew they had made the right choice to take the time necessary to fix the issues, the weight of external expectations was hard to ignore. The factory floor was buzzing with activity. Engineers worked around the clock, tweaking the integration of the hybrid system, hoping to fix the inconsistencies that had plagued the first batch of units. But even as progress was being made, Damien couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As the days passed, Maria and the engineering team had managed to make significant improvements, but there was still one persistent issue that refused to be resolved: the battery integration kept overheating during high-demand tests. It was a critical flaw that, if not fixed, would be a deal-breaker for the product. If they couldn't get it under control, they would have no choice but to scrap the entire batch, delaying the product release indefinitely. Damien paced in his office, his mind racing. "Why is this still happening?" he muttered under his breath. "We've tried everything. The design is solid, the materials are right, but the battery integration is still the weak point." The pressure was relentless, and it felt like every step forward was followed by 2 steps back. The team was exhausted, morale was beginning to slip, and Damien could sense the frustration mounting among everyone involved. He called an emergency meeting to discuss the issue. When the team gathered in the conference room, everyone was visibly drained, but determined. "All right, what's the status?" Damien asked, his voice betraying the stress he was feeling. Maria looked up from the notes in front of her, a serious expression on her face. "We're still dealing with the overheating issue. I've had the engineers work overtime to address it, but it's a complex problem. The hybrid system is drawing more energy than anticipated when the unit is under load, and the battery is not handling it well." Damien exhaled, rubbing his eyes. "I know it's not ideal, but we've got to figure this out. We can't afford another delay." There was a long pause, and then one of the senior engineers, Ben, spoke up. "We might need to rethink the battery design altogether. It's the only way we can be sure it won't overheat under high demand. I know it's a big ask, but we've hit a wall with the current design." Damien's heart sank. Rethinking the battery design. That meant starting over from scratch, and it could set them back weeks, possibly months. "I get it," he said quietly, looking around the room. "But if we change the design now, we're going to miss our window. Investors, media, everyone is waiting for this product. We'll lose everything." "I don't like it either, Damien," Maria said, her voice calm but firm. "But if we don't solve this now, we'll be risking the future of the product. It's not just about meeting the deadline. We have to deliver something that works, and works well. This product has to be reliable." Damien felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew she was right, but the thought of another setback was unbearable. Still, he couldn't ignore the consequences of pushing forward with a product that wasn't ready. The reputation of their company, the dreams they'd worked so hard to build, everything could collapse in an instant if they didn't get it right. "All right," Damien said, after a long pause, "we're going to rethink the battery. I don't care how much longer it takes. We do this right, or we don't do it at all." Maria and Ben exchanged a glance before nodding in agreement. The decision was made. It was an impossible choice, but the only one that made sense. There was no other option but to ensure the product was perfect, even if it meant starting over in some key areas. As the team set to work on a new plan, Damien felt a mix of frustration and determination. He was beginning to understand what his father had meant when he said this was a marathon, not a sprint. The road to success was going to be longer and harder than he'd ever anticipated, but he wasn't ready to back down. Late that night, after most of the team had gone home, Damien found himself alone in his office again, staring at the drawings and blueprints scattered across his desk. His mind kept returning to the same question: had he made the right call? Could they recover from this setback, or had they pushed too hard, too fast? As he leaned back in his chair, the door to his office opened. Maria stepped in, holding a tablet in her hands. "I just wanted to update you on the progress," she said quietly. "We've got the new battery prototype ready for testing. It's going to be a slow process, but we're confident this will solve the overheating problem." Damien looked at her, trying to read her expression. "How confident are we?" "Cautiously optimistic," Maria replied. "It's a new design, but it has the potential to work. We've tested the new components, and it's much more stable. We'll know more after tomorrow's tests." Damien nodded, trying to force himself to remain hopeful. "Okay. Let's see how it goes. We need to move fast, but we also need to get it right." As Maria left the room, Damien felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. They were at a crossroads. The decision to change the battery design might have been the right one, but it was a gamble, one that could either pay off spectacularly or cost them everything. He ran a hand over his face, weary from the constant stress. But as he looked out of his office window, his gaze fixed on the skyline, he realized something: the journey wasn't just about the product. It was about proving to himself, to his team, and to the world that they could overcome these challenges. That they could find a way to succeed, no matter how many times they stumbled. The real test wasn't the product, it was his ability to lead his team through the storm. And Damien was determined to do whatever it took to see this through. The week since the decision to overhaul the battery design had been a blur. Days turned into sleepless nights, and every moment felt like an eternity. Damien had always known that the road to success would be difficult, but nothing had prepared him for the weight of this moment. His team had worked tirelessly to make the new battery prototype work, and while they had made significant progress, the pressure from every angle was starting to crush him. The delay had become public knowledge. Media outlets were starting to ask hard questions, the investors were becoming restless, and worst of all, the competitors were circling, sensing weakness. Every article, every tweet, every comment added fuel to the fire. Was this company losing steam? Are they too far behind to catch up? The next big thing or just another flop? The world seemed to be watching, waiting for them to fail. Damien sat in his office late one evening, staring at his phone. It was another message from an investor, asking for an update. He didn't even need to read it, he knew what it said. The same questions, the same concerns, the same worries. How much longer? What was the plan? Was this product really as groundbreaking as they had said? His fingers hovered over the keyboard, composing a reply, but he stopped. It felt like they were at the precipice. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. He needed to remain focused, he reminded himself. The new battery design was still being tested, but the results had shown promise. They weren't out of the woods yet, but the hope of solving the issue was finally within reach. Suddenly, the door to his office opened, and Maria walked in, her face flushed with exhaustion. "Damien, we've got something. The latest round of tests on the battery, the new integration is working better than we expected." Damien's heart skipped a beat. He stood up, his pulse quickening. "Are you serious? It's passing all the tests?" "Not all of them, but we're seeing significantly better results. The overheating issue is under control, and the efficiency is now on par with our prototype. There's still some fine-tuning to do, but we're finally getting there." Damien felt a sense of relief wash over him, but he couldn't let his guard down yet. "So, what's the next step? What do we need to do to finalize this?" Maria exhaled, looking both relieved and apprehensive. "We'll need to run a few more tests tomorrow. We can't afford to have any surprises at this stage. But we're confident that with these adjustments, we're back on track. It's just going to take one more push to make sure everything's perfect." Damien nodded, trying to calm the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Good. We've waited too long for this. I don't want to rush it, but I need to know we can make the deadline. The world's watching us now." "I know. And we'll make it," Maria said, with a determination that gave him a small sense of hope. The next day, as the final tests were underway, Damien could barely sit still. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from the board, investors, and the media. Some were demanding answers, while others were trying to encourage him to stay the course. But the pressure was growing heavier by the hour. The test results came in, and this time, they were positive across the board. The new hybrid storage system was stable. The battery was functioning at peak performance. The product was finally ready to go to market. Damien stood in the factory, staring at the rows of completed units. There was a mix of excitement and disbelief. They had done it. The team had managed to solve the issues, even under the immense pressure. The product was everything they had promised, and more. It wasn't perfect, but it was damn close. The factory was buzzing with activity as the final batch was prepped for shipment. As Damien made his way through the production line, he caught sight of his father, Elon, who had arrived to check on the progress. His expression was calm, but there was a spark of pride in his eyes. "You did it, Damien," Elon said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "You led your team through one of the toughest challenges they'll ever face. And you didn't give up." Damien met his father's gaze, the weight of the past few months finally beginning to lift. "We didn't give up. We kept pushing, even when it seemed impossible. That's the key to success," Elon said with a smile. "It's not about how fast you get there. It's about how you handle the setbacks along the way. And you've done that better than most." Damien smiled, the sense of pride swelling in his chest. "Thanks, Dad." But even as he basked in the moment of victory, the reality of the situation wasn't far from his mind. The product was ready, but the hard work was far from over. Now came the ultimate test: could they actually pull off a successful launch? Could they turn this breakthrough into something that would truly change the industry? That afternoon, Damien and the team gathered for one last meeting before the product shipped. Maria, Ben, and the others were all there, their exhaustion evident but replaced with a glimmer of hope. "We've made it," Damien said, his voice strong but filled with emotion. "This product is everything we've worked for. It's not just about the technology, it's about the impact we can have on the world. But this is just the beginning. The launch is our next big hurdle. We need to make sure everything is perfect. I know we've had setbacks, but I believe in this team. I believe in all of you." The team exchanged determined looks. They had come so far, and they weren't about to let it slip away now. Every challenge, every sleepless night, every sacrifice, it had all led to this moment. And they were ready. Damien stood in front of them, feeling a surge of pride and gratitude. "We've got one shot at this. Let's make it count." As the meeting adjourned and everyone headed off to finalize preparations, Damien stepped outside into the cool evening air. For the first time in months, he took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment sink in. They had come through the storm. The product was ready, and they had done it together. But as he looked out over the horizon, Damien knew that the next chapter was about to begin. The world was about to see what they had created. And no matter the outcome, this journey had changed them all forever. The day had arrived, the product launch that could make or break everything. Damien stood at the edge of the stage, staring out at the massive crowd gathered in the conference hall. The press was buzzing, cameras flashing, and the anticipation in the room was palpable. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the unveiling of their groundbreaking product. This was the moment they had been working toward for years, and yet, the pressure was heavier than ever. Behind him, Maria, Ben, and the rest of the team stood with him, their faces a mixture of nervous excitement. The energy in the air was electric, but beneath it, Damien could feel the weight of the expectations bearing down on him. This wasn't just about the product, it was about everything they had sacrificed to get here. The countless hours of work, the late nights, the setbacks, and the moments of doubt. They were about to show the world what they had created. And in that instant, Damien realized that it wasn't just the success of the product on the line, it was the future of their company, the reputation of their team, and the trust they had built with their investors. Damien took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This was it. The moment of truth. As the lights dimmed and the countdown began, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The clock ticked down, second by second, until finally, the moment arrived. The screen behind him lit up with the logo of their product, and the crowd erupted into applause. Damien stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion as he addressed the audience. Thank you all for being here today. This is a pivotal moment, not just for our company, but for the future of innovation. What you're about to see is the result of countless hours of hard work, sacrifice, and dedication. It's a product that pushes the boundaries of what we thought was possible. And we believe it will change the way the world thinks about technology. The applause continued, but Damien's eyes were focused on the stage in front of him. The product, the hybrid system they had worked so tirelessly to perfect, was about to be revealed to the world. As he reached for the button that would unveil it, he couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. They had done it. The product was ready. With a swift motion, he pressed the button, and the screen behind him shifted to reveal the sleek, futuristic design of their latest innovation. The crowd gasped in awe as the product, glowing softly under the lights, was displayed for the first time. Damien smiled, his heart swelling with pride as the audience reacted to what they had created. The applause was deafening. The media was already capturing every moment, tweeting and posting about the groundbreaking technology. The product was everything they had promised, and more. But as the crowd's excitement filled the room, Damien couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The product had passed every test, but the true test would come when it reached the hands of the consumers. Would it live up to the hype? Would the world embrace it? Over the next few days, the buzz around the product grew louder. The reviews were overwhelmingly positive, and the media hailed it as a revolutionary breakthrough. Investors were pleased, and the stock price soared. It seemed like everything was falling into place. However, as Damien sat in his office reading the headlines, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the journey they had just completed. It wasn't the launch that mattered most, it was what came after. This was the beginning of a new chapter for the company, but the road ahead was far from certain. The competition would only grow fiercer, and there would be new challenges to face. But for now, Damien allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought back to the long nights spent in the lab, the struggles they had faced as a team, and the sacrifices they had made to get here. The road had been anything but easy, but they had persevered. As he glanced around his office, the familiar sound of his phone vibrating on the desk interrupted his thoughts. It was a message from his father, Elon. Damien smiled as he unlocked the phone. You did it, son. I'm proud of you. The hardest part is over. Now, keep pushing forward. The world is watching, but don't let that change who you are. Stay true to the mission. You've got this. Damien read the message again, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. His father had always been his greatest mentor, and in that moment, he realized just how much he had learned from him over the years. The pressure would never stop, it would only grow. But Damien was ready. Later that evening, as the team gathered for a celebratory dinner, there was a sense of camaraderie and relief in the air. The product launch had been a success, and they had proven to the world what they were capable of. But they all knew that the hard work didn't stop here. Damien, Maria said, raising her glass in a toast. We did it. We really did it. Damien smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. We did. But this isn't the end. It's just the beginning. The team cheered, and as Damien looked around the table at the faces of the people who had become more than just colleagues, who had become his family, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride. They had taken on the impossible and turned it into reality. And in that moment, Damien knew one thing for certain: no matter what the future held, they were ready for it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?